and Archana Pai is going to be talking about gravitational waves.
Hello guys, I hope I am audible. I think most of you might have
Yes.
seen me. Yeah, unfortunately we have to do this in a remote session. However, I hope you guys can get something out of it, and if you have any questions you can just ping me later. Alright, so I'll just give you a sort of not so short, a big capsule of gravitational wave astronomy in 1.5 hours. So I think the way we would do is I'll divide this 1.5 hours in two 45 minutes slots, because I don't believe that after 40 minutes typically the students sleep. So I'll give you some time to freshen up, maybe by 4:15, and then I will continue in the second half. Okay. All right. So I'm sort of assuming that this the students is basically they are combinations of BTechs and PhD and maybe MTechs and stuff like that. I do not really assume any formal background of GR. However, you don't need that as far as this lecture is concerned. Whatever you need it, I'll just tell you, and then you can just take it on its face value and yeah, use it if you want to use at any time. I don't know if Varun is going to put any questions on gravitational wave astronomy, but if so, then maybe you need to keep track of that. All right. Okay, so let's begin. You know that gravitational wave astronomy is pretty new astronomy, a brand new astronomy, maybe 5 years old in a strictest astronomy sense, in the sense that you observe things directly and then you infer based on the observations of about the system which you are going to observe. Of course, the historically there have been efforts to detect gravitational waves coming from, I mean, any kind of sources. Of course, I'll try to motivate you why astrophysical sources. Of course, the simplest answer is that they are huge, they are big, and they are compact, and hence, sort of, you expect the amplitude of the waves which it would produce would be sort of large, and it's very important to have high amplitude waveforms, because typically gravitational waves are extremely weak and tiny. Okay, so you can see, I hope you can see my cursor here. I assume yes. So there are a
Yeah,
couple of references I put down. So if anybody is interested, they can look at this reference. It's a big review, and it sort of summarizes. I mean, gives background, gives more references and things like that. So I think it's sort of it's a useful review if you want to look at things at more details. Okay, so let's go back 100 years, Einstein's GR. I'm just going to give you a gist of that. So essentially, Einstein formulated the law of gravitation. Okay, and as a gist, basically, what it uh, communicates is that if you have any matter, then essentially it deforms the geometry around the matter, and any object which is in a nearby object, essentially moves in that geometry. Okay, and that decides the trajectory of the objects. Okay, so this is a very different way of looking at things, more of a in a geometrical way, and this is primarily because of the equivalence principle. A simple way of looking at it is the following: when we try to solve Newton's second law of motion, right? And if you, let's say, try to find out motion of the objects under, let's say, gravity using Newton's law of gravity, then essentially we write the force to be equal to, so you basically we write ma, whereas acceleration is equal to mg, and then you cancel two m's, right? So when we do that, it never really occurs to us that these two m's can be actually, they are actually of different origin, right? Your first m, which is sitting on the left side, is essentially the inertial mass. Okay, it is the property of the mass or the property of the object, okay, to respond, right, to the applied force. And the second m is essentially the source. I mean, it is more, it's a gravitational mass, which is essentially property of the object which produces the force. Okay, so actually these two masses need not be, they need to be, they are same, but we live in the world where these two masses are same, and as a result the whole story changes, which if you sort of draw analogies, then this does not happen when you're trying to set, let's say, compute the trajectory of a charge, for example. Okay, so there always you get this q by m hanging out, right? Because of course, when you think about it, you say, oh, come on, I mean, the q is a charge and the force is, it's an electrostatic force, is not something same as that. But this is all just because of the way we are, so our mind is trained. When you think about it a bit more, essentially even gravity is also some kind of a force, and it's not necessary that that m has to be the same as this m. Okay, so it's essentially because of that, and that's the equivalence principle, which we have been using it for a long time. But when you sort of see the implications of the equivalence principle, the whole problem essentially reduces to motions, essentially on following, the geometry of what we call it as a space-time around objects. Okay. All right. So now, if this is the story, then you can imagine if you have, let's say, any object. Okay. So I've sort of, yeah. So those who are interested to know, I mean, essentially, if you take, let's say, the weak field and slow motion limit of this GR, then you can show that it goes to Newtonian gravity. It's a textbook exercise. When you learn GR, you will do that. Okay, and essentially in this particular limit, the Einstein's GR goes to Newtonian gravity. All right. So gravitational waves are essentially solutions of Einstein's equation in the linearized regime. When I talk about linearized, is basically you can take this background space-time fabric, right, to be the flat space-time, and essentially if you have a little perturbation, okay, which I've denoted here by h mu nu, okay, and if this is very small, okay, compared to the flat background, then you can show that this essentially follows wave solution in vacuum. Okay, so it essentially travels, okay, with speed of light in vacuum. Now the question is, what is this perturbation, or what perturbation, or what produces the perturbation? Okay, so here there is a sort of classic example. So let's say you have two objects, right, and each of them are going to produce their own field or own space-time fabric, and as they sort of move around, okay, move, in this particular case they are moving in a binary orbit, okay, then the space-time fabric around them is also going to follow that motion, and as a result you will see basically the perturbations in the form of waves which are leaving the source away from the source. Okay, and this is what we call it as gravitational waves. Okay, so these gravitational waves have certain properties, namely they travel with speed of light, then they are transverse in nature just like electromagnetic waves, and they essentially carry the bulk motion away from the source, or you can consider that they carry away asymmetry in terms of gravitational waves. Okay, the gravitational waves, they couple very weakly with matter, and just for your sort of doing a little bit back of the calculation, I have given you a formula which you can use to do a little calculation to compute if I give you a particular source, then what is the amplitude of these gravitational waves? Okay, so h here correspond to the amplitude of gravitational waves. R is the distance to the source. Okay, q is a quadrupole moment, and here we are talking about the double derivative of the quadrupole moment. So essentially, unlike electromagnetic waves, which the dominant contribution is dipolar in nature, the gravitational waves are quadrupolar in nature. So the dominant contribution is quadrupolar. All right, and this is a very simple, and h is dimensionless quantity. So you can do a typical dimensional analysis and try to, get order of magnitude estimate for h, given the source. All right. Okay, so if that is the case, I'll do a little exercise for you guys so that you can go and do little homework, and maybe I'll give you a problem, right, which Varun can put it in the exam. All right. So let's take this source, which is a terrestrial source. Okay, so let's take a rod of length, let's say 10 meters. Okay, and the mass is 10 to the power 3 kilograms. It's of course it's too heavy and too long rod. I mean, it's not going to stay like this. I mean, it will bend and stuff like that. But let's assume a sort of theoretical exercise, and then you compute, and let's imagine that this is a pivot. I'm trying to spin this rod, okay, along this pivot, and with some frequency, let's take some 10 hertz, and then you can compute, you can do an order of magnitude estimate and compute mv square, right? You can call that as, let's say, ml square omega square, and get the estimate of that, and just replace that in this formula, because q has the dimensions of mr square, and then you have dt square, so you can just replace this whole thing by non-spherical kinetic energy. Okay, if you compute this, this is a fair order of magnitude estimate of h. Here I am taking r to be, if this rod is spinning here, let's say r is somewhere in California or something like that, right? Roughly equal to the diameter of Earth. And then you can compute h, and then you will know that h is extremely tiny quantity. This is dimensionless quantity, but this essentially tells you what is the magnitude of gravitational waves if the rod is spinning here in Mumbai and if the observer is somewhere in California. Okay. Now this is extremely small quantity and it's very difficult to measure. Now I say, okay, let's replace this by an astrophysical source. So let's consider two neutron stars in a binary system. So you know what is the mass of neutron star, okay, and let's say orbital radius is maybe 1,000,000 kilometer, and you take some period, and I place this neutron star binary somewhere in our galaxy, let's say 5 kiloparsec. Okay, I redo this calculation, and you see that essentially this h gets improved, I mean, roughly by order of, I mean, almost like 20 orders magnitude. Okay, so you see that when you take very compact astrophysical sources, okay, the gravitational waves, the magnitude of the gravitational waves emitted by these sources, it increases just because of its compactness. Okay, and hence people started looking at the astrophysical sources to look for gravitational waves. Okay, here I've defined for you what we call it as a compactness parameter, right? So when we talk about compact objects, essentially we talk about objects with this compactness parameter g m by r. Okay, the rest are the constants which you can fix dimensionally. Okay, and for example, this compactness parameter, if you look at our sun, it's almost like 4 into 10 to the power minus 6, which greatly increases by almost like order of 5 orders when you go to neutron stars, and the black hole has the compactness of 1. Essentially, this alpha is defined as 1, assuming black hole. So basically, black hole is the most compact object, right? It is packed in a very tiny mass, right? And because of which the gravitational pull of the black hole is extremely high. All right. So now this compactness plays very important role. So for example, if you want to compute what is the gravitational wave luminosity, okay, or let's say I've written this luminosity, which is essentially is the square of the double derivative of triple derivative of quadruple moment. I've rewritten this in terms of compactness parameters. So this is a compactness parameter. So you can see here it's gm over rc square is a factor of 2 here. So let's not worry about that factor. You can pull it out. Okay, so let's say this is alpha, which is a compactness parameter. So higher is this value, essentially the more luminous in quote unquote in the object is in the gravitational wave window. Okay. Similarly, higher is more the relativistic is the object, okay, your luminosity increases. Okay, so if you take very high and relativistic system, I mean, when I take here, I mean, essentially I've just put this as 1 and this as 1, then L is almost like 10 to the power 52 watts. Just for your reference, the luminosity of sun is 10 to the power 26 watts, and a typical galaxy's luminosity is 10 to the power 37 watts. So you can see it is many orders of magnitude higher, right, than even a typical galaxy. So essentially, your gravitational wave object, right? If you take a compact object, very highly relativistic, it is extremely luminous object in the gravitational wave window. Okay. However, this luminous object actually produces very less strain. So basically, we call gravitational waves or gravitational wave objects as such that you need, or the membrane as such, the space-time membrane as such, that you need enormous energy, okay, to perturb this membrane, and which can actually make H, which is of detectable size, basically. Okay, and that's how the gravitational wave astronomy sort of is quite distinct than the electromagnetic astronomy. Okay, so I mean, it is not just the luminosity which really matters here. What matters is what luminosity, how it translates into the measurement of H. All right, so here there is a homework for you. Okay, so compute gravitational wave strength from, let's say, Earth's sun system observed, let's say, at the distance of Andromeda galaxy. So you can use the same little formula which I gave you, and you can plug in things and see how much amplitude of gravitational waves you will get. Okay, so the story is not really complete without describing. Yes.
There are a couple of questions in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go on.
Himansh, Kapil, you have your hand raised, right?
Yeah, so I actually about the alpha value that we talked about. In there, you defined that the alpha of black hole for the specific values was made to be 1. Yeah, but like again, I'm not completely sure about, but as far as I know, black holes do have different masses and different radiuses.
Sure.
So they will have a different alpha. So we
No.
just
They
use
all have one.
Okay, all have.
Yes,
Okay.
because the Schwarzschild radius is defined like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a good question. So basically, the Schwarzschild radius is R is nothing but 2gm by c square.
Okay, so both of them are interconnected to each other to keep the alpha
Exactly.
one.
So if you so when you have, well, alpha is defined later. Okay, the Schwarzschild radius comes directly from GR. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so it actually scales with m. So if you have, let's say, mass of 9 m sun, then the radius of that would be 27 kilometers. Okay.
Yep. Got it. Yeah.
Okay. Any other question?
Ma'am, what do you mean by gravitational wave luminosity?
It's the amount of, I mean, the same thing as you. It's the amount of energy per unit time.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any other question? Okay, fine. Okay, so let's move ahead. So before the whole story of detection of gravitational wave and the gravitational astronomy, etc. Okay, there was a very important discovery of Hull stellar binary pulsar. So I thought I should spend some time on that. Yeah, time there. So basically, in the year 1975, okay, there was a discovery of a radio pulsar, okay, by Hulse and Taylor. Okay, so basically they discovered a double neutron star system, and what they saw was that if you measure basically, so here is the plot from the paper itself. So let's say on the x-axis is year, and on the y-axis is the cumulative shift of periastron time. Okay, so essentially they measured, they were mapping, let's say, the orbit of the Hull stellar binary pulsar. So in this binary pulsar, one was a pulsar and the other was a neutron star. Okay, so when you have a pulsar, I'm sure I think you must have learned when you got your radio astronomy lecture that the pulsars are basically they are neutron stars with very high magnetic field, and when you have axis which is not the orbital axis and magnetic axis is not aligned, and let's say if then essentially they emit pulses in radio band, and let's say if you are on along the line of sight, then you will see this pulse and you can measure, right? You can observe the pulse, right? So now imagine that this is in the binary system, and when the binary system, when you have, let's say, when you observe this, right, you are going to observe the pulsar, and then using that you can map the binary system, map the binary orbit. Okay, so with this observation of this pulsar, they mapped the binary orbit, and what they saw was that there was a shift in the periastron position, okay, of this in this binary orbit, and the shift was the cumulative shift is essentially plotted. Okay, so what it tells you is that there is some loss, right, in energy, right, because it's not really coming back to the same position, and this was sort of due to the emission of gravitational waves. So here the spectacular thing about this discovery is that all these black points are essentially the observations. So you can see that the observation was done for 30 years or something like that, right? And this was these are the observations, and the solid curve is essentially, the curve comes from the theoretical prediction, okay, from GR. Okay, and you see how good is the match between the observations and the theory. And this was a spectacular discovery. In fact, this was using this you can actually test GR. Okay, and this was the first system using which you could actually test alternative way of testing general theory of relativity. And this was an indirect evidence of the existence of gravitational waves, and which received Hulse and Taylor both received Nobel Prize for the discovery of this pulsar in 1993. Okay. Now this essentially created a lot of excitement in the field because though the strain or the amplitude h, which we are talking about, is extremely low, the fact that there was a detection of a system which indicates the emission of gravitational wave itself was quite encouraging. Okay, so now the rest of the thing I'm going to divide it into three parts. One is gravitational wave sources, gravitational wave detectors, and then the LIGO-Virgo detections. Okay, so let's begin. So as I told you guys that what produces gravitational waves. So you saw that there is this h is essentially proportional to this double derivative of quadrupole moment, and that itself tells you that any system which has a time varying quadrupole moment will produce gravitational waves. So there are lots of such systems. You can have binary system as is shown here. You can have, let's say, supernova explosion, which can produce gravitational waves, that can produce a burst of gravitational waves. You can have accreting systems, right? So where there's accretion, there's an accretion disk. You can see that there is a mass inflow, and because of which that would produce gravitational waves. Okay, you can have basically, this is a binary pulsar. I mean, this is a depiction of black holes. And then you can also have, let's say, a GRB. Okay, so you can have a neutron star, and then I mean two neutron stars, collision of that, and which produces gamma ray burst. You can also have a pulsar, which is with the mountain on top of it, and as it sort of rotates, right, then that also would produce gravitational waves, because that gives rise to a non-zero variation of quadrupole moment, and then that would emit a continuous kind of gravitational waves. If you take, let's say, two objects at the centers of these two galaxies, then the mergers of galaxies will compel the central black holes to form in the binary system, and they eventually would merge, and that these systems, we call it as the mergers of supermassive black holes at the centers of the two different galaxies. Okay, so that also can produce gravitational. So there are lots of sources. Okay, I mean, we have basically zoo of astrophysical sources. There are many more sources which are not really described. Okay, so broadly we divide the sources in three categories. Okay, one is a continuous wave sources, which is essentially emitting continuous waves of gravitational waves. Okay, it's a continuous emission. Then you have, so for example, pulsars, the waves which are emitted by isolated pulsars, they are continuous wave emission, because as the pulsar is rotating, it keeps emitting gravitational waves of sinusoidal nature, and you can observe it, and then you can infer about the source, about the, you know, the mountain or the asymmetry on the source and stuff like that. We have not observed any continuous wave gravitational wave source so far. Then there are burst sources, like what I just mentioned to you about the supernova explosion, or you can have, let's say, massive black holes merging. Okay, they typically emit very short duration gravitational wave sources in our current detectors. I'll talk about the detectors a bit later. And then the third class of sources are essentially stochastic gravitational wave sources. Now, stochastic gravitational wave sources could be basically primordial sources, that is something which has happened at the Big Bang, okay, and that information is essentially imprinted in the gravitational waves produced, right, at that epoch, okay, and which one can observe now, okay. So right, so which, and that is quite unique information, because that is about the information about the Big Bang, or, you know, even the inflationary scenario. All that information would be imprinted in the gravitational waves emitted at that epoch. Now this is quite interesting, because the CMB, okay, the cosmic microwave background emission, does not carry that information, because that CMB only comes, you know, at the end of the last scattering surface. Okay, and the information which you would get from gravitational waves is even before that. Okay, so that's quite interesting, and people are looking at stochastic gravitational wave sources as well. All right. So yeah, so as far as the pulsars are concerned, I think you guys already know about pulsars. So I think I can skip this slide. I mean, essentially it just tells you that what the pulsars are, and essentially when it spins, it can emit radio waves as well as gravitational waves. Okay, here I've given you a little estimate of the neutron star. So let's say if you have a bumpy neutron star, I mean, it's the same story actually, right? And you can define what is the ellipticity, right? And using that, right, you can estimate what is the strain produced, the amplitude of the gravitational waves emitted by this, because of this mountain sitting on this neutron star. Okay, and typically the frequency of the gravitational wave emitted by the source would be twice the orbital frequency, sorry, the rotational frequency of this source. Okay, similarly you can have, let's say, accreting system, and then you know, you can have, let's say, a companion star, and then you have, let's say, a compact object, which is accreting the mass, and depending upon the rate of accretion, okay, it can produce gravitational waves, and which can be observed as a burst of gravitational waves. Right. Similarly, I was just talking about the core collapse of massive stars. Typically, the gravitational wave burst from these sources lasts for, let's say, millisecond duration, and we expect that typically such events can happen in our galaxy, maybe 2 per century. I mean, we are actually waiting for such event to happen in our galaxy so that we can actually observe them. But this is a very interesting source because we know that the supernova source has rich information. Also, you can observe them in electromagnetic window, and then when there are prospects to do multi-messenger astronomy with this source. Okay, so now with this zoo of sources we discussed, the rest of the lecture I will focus on the compact binaries. So the compact binaries are essentially binary systems with neutron star and black holes, and they are the primary sources of gravitational waves. Okay, so essentially what we are talking about here is that if you have, so let's yeah, this is a slide with, you know, how the binaries are formed in various, I mean, how white dwarf, let's say, binaries, etc. form. So let's not worry about the first 3 columns. Go to the last column. So essentially, when you have double neutron star system, you expect that they might be formed from the main sequence star. Okay, and in this formation, essentially both the stars has they have to basically finish their stellar evolution and go through the cycle, right? So the first event, essentially it would explode as a supernova. You will get a compact object, and then there would be a mass transfer onto this neutron star, right? And after which there would be a expulsion of the common envelope, and then there would be a remaining, let's say, a remnant which essentially collapses into a compact object due to gravity. So you expect that such a system essentially survives after, you know, going through this explosion in both the events, and such systems are observed. I mean, especially, of course, if you want to observe them in the electromagnetic window, then if one of them is pulsar, then you can observe them in radio, and right. So far there are not many systems have been observed. So yeah, I think by now there must be something like 13 to 15 systems are observed in our galaxy so far, and these are I mean, these are important systems for gravitational wave astronomy. We already know that we have already observed a couple of them in the gravitational wave astronomy window as well. All right. So the bottom line is that when you have compact objects, especially double neutron star, you can observe them in the electromagnetic window. But if you have neutron star black hole or black hole system, then the only sort of window where you can gather more information is the gravitational wave window, because especially with the black hole systems, because it's you cannot probe black hole binaries in the electromagnetic windows, just because of the nature of black hole. It cannot really emit light, right, from the system. Okay, so now let's try to understand what kind of system are we talking about. So essentially it's a binary system, right, a compact binary system which essentially emits gravitational waves twice its orbital frequency. Okay, and it loses energy, and as the 2 stars approach, they emit more and more gravitational waves with increasing frequency and increasing amplitude, and finally the system merge and forms a single black hole. So this is a typical signature of binary compact binary merger. So you have this long inspiral, what we call it as inspiral. So this phase is the inspiral phase. Okay, then it merges, and then you have a ring down. Okay, so the signal which we are looking for, right, is something of this nature in the data. Okay, so you can, I've drawn pictures for different, the compact binaries with different masses. So higher is the mass, shorter the signal, and the duration of the signal essentially tells you what kind of, what kind of mass it would essentially have. Okay, so here there are basically two types of detectors. Okay, what we call it as earth-based detectors. Okay, and which are on Earth, and there are proposal for the space-based detectors. And if you take, let's say, such detectors, then the sources like the compact binary sources will essentially spend a long time, right? Depending upon the mass. So if you have a lower mass, then it will spend more time in the Earth band compared to the high mass system. Okay, but then if you are going to talk, so as I just described to you, right, that as it sort of comes close to each other, the frequency increases, right? So the system essentially starts from here, this point, and then it, so this is the, you can treat it as a let's say frequency window of a particular detector. Okay, so it will start from here and it will end here. Okay, and depending upon the amount, number of cycles it spends, you using that, and of course the distance, etc., you can how much power it is going to spend in a particular detector band. Now the same system, if you are going in the space band, okay, in the space band essentially you go to the lower frequencies, and you have a longer arm length, okay, or the longer baseline, and in that case you are essentially, the system is takes place earlier in the space band. Okay, so the nature of the system essentially depends on the kind of detectors which you are looking at. So this is a very peculiar feature of gravitational astronomy, which you can sort of view as when you observe let's say a particular astronomical event from different bands, different electromagnetic bands. Okay, the nature, the features of the source is very different in different electromagnetic bands. Similarly, the features of a gravitational wave source is quite different when you observe from different detectors, because they are spanning different frequency bands. Okay, so I'm going to skip this as well. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the detectors. Okay, I'll take another 5 minutes, and then I'm going to give a break of 2-3 minutes, and then we'll come back to the other the later part. Okay, so when you talk about the detectors, of course you need very sensitive detectors. Okay, and since the H itself is very low, as I've shown you, okay, the problem becomes very tricky because you are essentially looking at the signal in a very noisy data. So the problem is double, twofold. One is you need to have good detectors, sensitive detectors, as well as you need to have special techniques to fetch a signal which is deeply buried in the noise, the detector noise. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. So okay, so what are the, how do you basically, what is the main principle of the gravitational wave detectors? Okay, so for that I want to just show you one video which essentially tells you what is the effect of gravitational waves on when it falls on, let's say, on Earth. Okay, so let's take a ring of particles. You can imagine this to be a plane. As the gravitational waves pass the system, then you can see that the ring is oscillating, right? Uh, uh, for one half cycle, it is oscillating along this direction and then along this direction. Okay, so essentially depending upon the frequency of gravitational wave, that decides this oscillation. But what you can see is that essentially there is a compression, right, and then there is a strain and stress essentially produced in this ring, and we can use this. This is the property which is used to build the detectors. Okay, there are two polarizations. So one polarization essentially stretches the circle into ellipse in vertical and horizontal direction, and the other polarization will stretches in the same way, just by making 45-degree angle with respect to this. Okay, all right. So the first attempt to detect gravitational waves was done by Joe Weber Okay, he was a professor in Maryland University, and what he said that, okay, the idea was quite neat, that why can't we use resonant bars, metal bars, to detect gravitational waves. So the idea was very simple, that imagine that there is some gravitational wave source in our galaxy, okay, and imagine that if you have, let's say, the metal bar, the frequency, the fundamental frequency, or the higher, any of the higher modes, right, of the metal bar, if let's say if it coincides with the gravitational waves, impinging gravitational waves, then there would be a resonant, and then you can measure that, okay, using the resonant bar detector. Okay, so he spent a lot of I mean, he spent a lot of time and effort constructing bars, improving bars, right? And in fact, in 1968, he announced that he detected gravitational waves. And so this is a paper actually where he announced the gravitational wave discovery in the year 1968, which created a lot of excitement in the field. First of all, people did not believe this. However, everybody became very curious, and lots of resonant bar detectors were constructed subsequently. So there were many bars built in MIT, in IBM, Glasgow, Germany, Italy, all over the world, and they were trying to essentially prove the result, which was quoted in this paper by Joe Weber. Okay, so there was a big consortium, and these detectors were actually working till 2000, early 2000, improving their sensitivities. They also went into the cryogenic, and then improved the sensitivity in the narrow band, etc., etc. Okay, so there was, so this in fact, this whole announcement created a lot of excitement, and there was a lot of curiosity, and which eventually culminated into what we see as the interferometric detectors, which with which we could actually discover the gravitational waves. Okay, of course, later on it was proved that the claim which he made was not really consistent with astrophysical observation, and that whole thing stayed there. Okay, so earlier, okay, Felix Pirani, essentially he plays very crucial role in construction, or in the essentially the idea of what you can do, right, to measure basically these changes, because what he said is that you can observe, you can use light, okay, to determine the coordinates of the neighboring free test objects. And this was the principle based on which essentially Rainer Weiss, he realized that you can use laser interferometers to detect gravitational waves. And subsequently, the concept of LIGO came in, where the feasibility study was made, and then the proposal was made in 1989, which got subsequently approved, and then the LIGO started getting constructed. Okay, so what is the main principle? The principle is the principle of interferometry. So basically, you have Michelson interferometer. You can imagine that there is a laser beam shining on both the directions, and then you're collecting it. And then if there is any change in length, then that will get essentially measured in the phase shift, which you can finally basically detect using the photodetector. So that's the basic principle. Of course, though I say it so simply, it is not so simple, because when you talk about all this, you need to ensure that these mirrors are free. Okay, so all these mirrors are suspended, which are shown here. Okay, these mirrors are actually suspended. Okay, so there is this video of, I'll just take a minute for you to watch this. So you can see as you change the length, you can see basically change in intensity here, which you can probe. Okay, so these are the main instruments. They are in US. Okay, one in Hanford and another in Louisiana, and all the mirrors are suspended. Okay, and they are essentially trying to measure this change in length, and try to basically. So besides this, there are lots of other things. For example, you have not only this suspension, but you have a febrile cavity using this, you essentially extend the arm length, okay, by doing multiple reflections. So that is one technique. The whole thing is kept in vacuum. So there are a lot of engineering techniques are used and tested to the ultimate limit in order to achieve the sensitivity of what we need to probe the compact binary mergers. So far there are two LIGOs, one in Hanford, another is in Livingston. There is Virgo, which is in the outskirts of city Pisa, in Italy. Then there is a Japanese detector which is getting constructed in the Kamioka and Kande site, and then we expect that the LIGO India will come up in a decade or so. Okay, so I'm going to skip some noise sources. If those who are interested in engineering and if they want to know a little bit more about that, they can contact me. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. Okay, so what is the advanced LIGO? So essentially, it's a kilometer arm length optical laser interferometer in Michelson configuration with the Fabry-Perot cavities, multi-stage suspension, and ultra high vacuum. Okay. Please note, when I talk about this vacuum, it's essentially 1 trillionth of atmospheric pressure, which is packed in 10,000 meter cube volume. So you can imagine how UHV we have here, and then there are low loss suspensions with very high Q and very high reflectivity and extremely high power lasers, which are trying to measure the motion, which is 10,000 times smaller than the atomic nucleus, which is caused due to the violent events in the universe, which are located at millions and billions of light years away. Okay, so it's an engineering and technological marvel. And this is one field of astronomy which I can definitely claim, which combines the engineering, physics and mathematics and astrophysics and gravity and computers and everything together, right, in the compact way, because without that we wouldn't have really discovered gravitational waves. So there are some pictures here of LIGO mirror. You can see the suspensions. You can see there is a control room where the person is trying to monitor different channels. Because if you can imagine that there is all this electronics and mechanics, everything needs to be monitored and controlled. Okay, so there is a huge control room to take care of that. And using that, essentially we reach the sensitivity which is close to the strain. So when I talk about strain, it is essentially H, which is delta L by L of the order of 10 to the power minus 23. Okay, so at this point I'm going to take a small break. Varun, is Varun there?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just take break of, let's say, 2 to 3 minutes, and then I
sounds
will.
good.
Okay,
so
fine.
I will just pause the recording if it allows me to.
Okay, fine.
Oh, I can't
Or you
actually
can-
pause it.
Or you
I
can just
can
break
only
it into
stop it.
parts.
Yeah. Okay,
Is that
sounds
fine?
good.
Yeah, I'll be back in 2 minutes. Okay.
Okay, thanks.